Радіаційні онкологи, медичні фізики, слава Україні. Дуже дякуємо, що продовжуєте приєднуватися до Research Methodology Course for Ukraine. Help Ukraine Group, Austria International Research and Development Committee are excited to present the 10th lecture in the course, and our topic is very exciting. It's scientific writing and publishing in peer-reviewed journals. It's a very useful topic. I think everyone should know how to write a paper and how to publish. Our speaker today is Dr. Michael Goldstein. He's a physician scientist at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine and assistant professor of radiation oncology and oncology. He is a member of Sydney Kimmel Comprehensive Cancer Center and leads independent research lab within the Department of Radiation Oncology and Molecular Radiation Sciences. Dr. Goldstein earned his MD PhD from Johannes Gutenberg University in Mainz, Germany. He completed postdoctoral research fellowship at St. Jude Children's Research Hospital and Duke University, followed by clinical residency training in radiation oncology at Washington University, St. Louis. Clinically, his practice focuses on treatment of GU malignancies. Goldstein Lab investigates molecular mechanism underlying cellular responses to DNA damage induced by radiation and chemotherapy. The primary objective of his research is to define DNA damage response pathways that can be therapeutically modulated to improve cancer treatment outcomes. His work employs both in vitro and in vivo models across multiple human malignancies, and a major focus of Dr. Goldstein's research is the study of epigenetic alterations at sites of DNA damage, including chromatin structure modeling and post-translational histone modification. These processes are critical for DNA repair, making chromatin-modifying enzymes promising targets for radiosensitization and chemosensitization. In addition, his lab examines global epigenetic programs that regulate tumor response to therapy. Ultimately, his research aims to identify cancer-specific epigenetic signaling pathways that can be exploited to enhance the effectiveness of radiation and systemic treatments. But he's not going to talk about this today, maybe tangentially, but he will talk about how to publish and how to write scientific articles, and the Ukrainian community is really honored to host you here and have you with us today. Thank you so much. You have a busy schedule. I'm glad you were able to make it. So the podium is yours. I'll stop sharing. We are eagerly looking forward to your presentation.
Дуже дякую, Наталя. Доброго вечора, шановні колеги. Слава Україні!
Героям слава!
Як Наталя казала, мені звати Міша Гольдштейн, я радіоонколог в Джонс Хопкінс. Я працюю як клінічний радіоонколог, також маю лабораторію. І завжди, коли я роблю які-то доклади, ми більше спілкуємося про те, що ми робимо в лабораторії, але сьогодні це буде трошки інакше, так що ми будемо спілкуватися про як писати і публікувати manuscripts. Так, can this start sharing? All right. So I'll do the talk in English, but again, if there are any questions or unclarities, please interrupt. Don't wait till the end. Ask me if you want to ask in Ukrainian. Go ahead. I'll do my best to answer as much as, as much as I can. So, yeah, we'll talk about publishing. Very, very interesting, exciting topic that anybody who deals with research on the clinical, basic science, or side has to deal, and it's exciting and rewarding, and also very, very frustrating until you really get till the very end, like all of you, I'm sure, know. So this is the outline of my talk. We're gonna first talk about things to consider before you even start writing the manuscript, because that's going to be important. You want to think about those things prospectively, so you don't have to do the job later on. Then we're going to talk about, once you, even again, before we start writing the manuscript, how to search for the right journal, for an appropriate journal. Then we'll talk about writing the manuscript, different concepts, how to approach it. We'll talk about what is a paper actually comprised of, so different parts of the paper, what's important, what to pay attention to. Then we'll talk about the actual submission process, then how to deal with reviews once you get the reviews back, and then how to deal with rejection, which is obviously the most frustrating, but unfortunately the most common part of this whole story. So first part, things to consider before writing the manuscript. And honestly, the slides are there to provide you some visual context and perhaps even more so for me to kind of remind me of what I wanted to talk about, but I really want it to be more interactive. There's not really much, again, data to show. Like I don't have any cool illustrations or anything. So please, feel free to interrupt me and ask questions and, bring in comments, talk about maybe some, particular circumstances, like when you had issues with publishing and that you would like to discuss. And I'm also going to, name multiple examples and recall multiple examples from my journey as a scientist and physician when we had issues with publishing and what we did to overcome it. So before writing the manuscript, first thing I would say, start well ahead of time. Oftentimes you think, okay, I'm going to get this done within a couple of weeks, couple of months. The experience tells it's always going to take much longer than you initially planned. So in order not to put yourself under time pressure, again, start well ahead of time, especially if you have a deadline. What I like to do, even as the manuscript is starts to really kind of get together as we're gathering the data, even before we have the final really manuscript and all the figures together, all the data collected, I like to start thinking about the final shape of the paper and the manuscript, maybe when we have 50-60% of all the material, all the data that you're planning to put into the manuscript, because then you really start seeing where the gaps are, what else might need, might have to be done, what additional analysis, like let's say if you do clinical research, retrospective clinical research, what additional statistical analysis you might do, what additional data you might need to do. Do you have enough patient numbers, things like that. When it comes to, again, laboratory research, then you might start thinking, okay, what additional experiments you might have to do to close those kind of gaps. Then what are the priorities in publishing your work? And I'm talking about your particular priorities for that particular manuscript. And there are different things to consider. One is the level of the journal, right? I mean, obviously there are different journals, different levels, different impact factors, different levels of status and popularity. And as one scientist, like experienced professor once told me, when it comes to publishing, you can publish everything. And that is actually true. You literally can take anything, almost like a blank piece of paper, and publish it. And you're going to find a journal that's going to accept it and publish it, provided you're going to pay them for it, right? And I mean, you can start a journal of your own. You can make money. Like you say, I publish whatever, just pay me like $2,000 for publication, right? Now, of course, this journal isn't going to, win the prize for fame. It's going to be probably a very low impact factor. I presume somewhere around 0, but you can still publish it. So the reason why I'm saying that is you're always going to be able to publish your paper. You'll find a journal that's going to accept it. But it's always a balance, right, of publishing it in the best possible journal ever versus, again, what you can achieve, obviously, and how much effort you want to put in. But one of the first things to consider is obviously what's the level of the journal where you can get your work published. So again, you use your experience, you can ask people, and oftentimes it's very important, again, to ask somebody else to read your manuscript and give you some advice on what they think where it might go. Oftentimes we're really in love with our project, so we tend to be very biased, or it's, how good they are, and not so much how good in terms of the data quality, really, but in terms of the impact, right? Like how impactful are they going to be? How well are they going to be received by the field? How much interest are they going to induce? And based on that, then, you can decide which journal it might be appropriate for. Another important point is timing, right? Sometimes you might be in a situation where you have to publish relatively fast. It could be because, for example, you're resubmitting a grant, and in the grant review, by the NIH, they say, well, your grant looks great, your research proposal is great, but you haven't published anything in the past 3 years. Now you have a work, you can publish it, and you can use that, for example, to, again, substantiate your grant application. And that means that you might have to publish as soon as possible. So in that case, again, timing is of essence. So you might not try to really go for the best and highest journal where you can publish it, but really try to get it, published still in a good journal, but relatively fast. But because of that, you might have a trade-off that you go to a bit of a lower level journal. Another important part is obviously the time that you're going to need for the revision, because that's typically what takes the longest. Then, of course, another very important part are also the costs, right? The publishing costs a lot of money, and especially in recent years, it's become really exorbitantly expensive. It's thousands of dollars. And journals that are really famous, we're not talking about thousands, we're talking about tens of thousands of dollars. Could be easily like 10, 15, 20,000. Now, again, if your paper is accepted in Nature, it's probably going to be worth it, right, for you. But that's something you have to keep in mind. And again, as I said, publishing for the journals, for the publishers, is a business, so they want to make as much money as possible. And so again, even low-level journals, they're going to still charge you a pretty high amount of money. And then, of course, there are different things that go into it. There is a baseline fee, and then you might also have to pay for each figure. And then if you want the figure to be in color, you might pay much more money. So these are all the things to consider. Maybe you don't necessarily need all figures to be in color. And you might make some of them black and white to save the costs. So all right, so now after we have considered all of this and we kind of have our concept of what our manuscript might look like at the end, and now we start searching for the journal and thinking what could be the right journal for our beloved work. So this is still happening before writing the manuscript. So let's look for a journal. Again, when it comes to the journal, we already talked about, or I've already talked about it in the past couple of minutes. When you're considering the journal, again, one of the things you consider is obviously the field. Probably should have put that first, right? Is the journal really appropriate? It might be a great high-level journal, but not necessarily appropriate for this particular paper, right? I mean, you might try to publish a radiation oncology paper in a surgical journal, which, as a matter of fact, they might like it and accept it. But in the end, that might not be the best target for it, right? Then obviously you're all familiar with the impact factor, which gives you kind of an idea of the fame, prestige of that particular journal. Again, there are a million opinions about the impact factor. Some people say that's the single most important thing. Some people say that absolutely doesn't matter. Like always, the truth is somewhere in the middle. I mean, suffice it to say that typically the journals that everybody wants to publish in, be it Nature Science, New England Journal of Medicine, JCO, and so on, when it comes to clinical journals, they all have very high impact factor, right? So there is definitely a correlation between impact factor and then the level of impact of the journal. Now, in the end, you might publish a paper in a very high-level journal, but the paper doesn't seem to be very interesting to the field, so you're not going to have nearly as many citations as the impact factor is. And by the way, impact factor, probably most of you know it, but it's basically the number of citations of a paper published in the journal per year. So, for example, if an impact factor is 20, that means that on average, probably median, rather than average, a paper published in the journal is going to be cited about 20 times a year. So that's the impact factor. Now, besides impact factor, prestige can be defined just by the recognition, name recognition of the journal. I can, for example, give you an example of a journal called Genes and Development that maybe some of you have heard of, maybe many of you have heard of. It's a relatively famous journal. It's been around for a long time. Great breakthrough works have been published in this journal, but I would say its impact factor has actually slipped in the recent maybe 10, 15 years to where I think at some point it was below 10. And there are some cancer journals, like, for example, molecular cancer with a much higher impact factor, or, for example, nucleic acid research, which is normally focusing on basic science, is an impact factor for, I believe, like 15 or 16, so higher than genes in development. But the name recognition of G and D might be higher than the other two that I named. So that's another thing to consider. Obviously, the focus, meaning, what do they really publish? Is it more surgical, radiation oncology, basic translational, clinical science, and so on? Another important thing to consider, again, especially the time is of the essence, is also how fast is the turnaround process in the journal. And they can really vary. I know AACR journals actually have done a relatively good job, especially cancer research in the recent years. So I think they really try to get the reviews done within 2 weeks, maybe plus minus, 1 week. Other journals, I remember I had an experience in PNAS where it took them literally like 2 months to first review the paper. And then I think 6 weeks to look at the resubmission. Luckily, we got it accepted at the end, but it really took very, very long time. So it's something, that you can easily find out just by typing it in Google and get like a quick AI analysis of the review speeds and what people have reported, again, if time is of the essence. My personal opinion is, again, when you're looking for a journal, you can be a bit daring, but overall, you don't want to go too high and you don't want to go too low. Again, by too high, I mean trying to publish in the best possible journal ever, which is probably out of reach for you in terms of just the quality of the work. Versus, you also don't want to go too low and sell your work for amount of, well, not money in this case, but impact factor points, if that's a good way to put it. That's really below what your paper is really worth. Now, the trade-offs are basically, if you're trying, like, what's the issue of trying to sell it too high, is that very likely you're going to have rejections, and then you have to rewrite the manuscript, and then basically you're just losing time. It adds on to the frustration, up to you if you're ready to deal with that or not. But definitely you're going to be losing some time. And you also have to invest time anytime you resubmit your paper, right? So you have to think how mindful you want to be about your effort in this particular case. And obviously, selling it too low, thinking, okay, impact factor doesn't matter, where I publish doesn't matter, people still going to pay attention if it's a good paper. Partially, it is true. Some papers are published in journals that don't have very high impact factor, but then in the end, enjoy a lot of attention by the field. And again, it may or may not work out, but in the end, you still don't want to sell it too low, for the sake of time or money. But one of the examples, for example, again, I was co-author in a paper. I'm sure pretty many of you are familiar with the CRISPR technology, basically where you use a special bacterial protein that you can program using gRNA to cut at virtually anywhere in the genome. And the people who discovered it and developed this method, they received the Nobel Prize several years ago, like very well-deserved Nobel Prize. I think probably around 15 years ago, when I was a postdoc at Duke, we worked and collaborated with a lab there that literally just used the CRISPR technology to get rid of HPV proteins A6 and A7 in HPV-infected cells, and to show that you can actually target cancer cells, but specifically targeting genes that are only present in cancer, right? Because like you're going to have HPV-induced cervical cancer, for example, they're going to express the 6 and the 7, and that way you can target those cells with gRNA, with CRISPRs, and then induce double-strand break. So it was like really a proof of concept paper, like very, very far from any therapeutic application. But so the lab got the paper together, we helped them measure the breaks and toxicity, and they knew that they're about to be scooped, and so they submitted it to a journal of virology, which I think that time point had an impact factor of maybe 6 or 7. That paper, in the first probably 10 years after it got published, was cited an average 40 times a year because it was really like a proof of concept paper. So you see it was like, almost, 7, 8 times higher than the impact factor of the journal. So this is one example where, again, in fact, they had to publish it fast because they heard some news that somebody else might be trying to get very similar workouts and publish that. And so they published in a low-level journal, again, for this particular paper, but in the end, it paid off. So, and again, as I said, just really going to the next point, long-term success of your publication is going to be measured in citations of your particular paper, not the impact factor of the journal. But of course, if you publish in a high-level journal, there is a high likelihood that somebody is going to see your paper. So there's definitely a correlation there. Now, when you're considering, and this is a very, very important point, this one, not one, but multiple, I probably should have made it in bold. So the way I approach, when I start thinking and selecting journals where I want to submit my paper, and I deliberately say journals and not journal, is because I always select typically 3, maybe even 4 journals where I might want to submit that paper that I think might be appropriate. And the reason is because I do that because I want to spare myself a future work. I assume that if I submit it, it might get rejected or very likely to get rejected. So you have to do it several times. And each time you resubmit your paper, you're going to have to rewrite it to a certain degree, right? Because every journal has different formatting, potentially different length of the abstract, And they can vary a little bit and they can vary a lot. Like again, taking the top journals, let's take Science and let's take Cell. And if you look at a Science publication versus a Cell publication, they are extremely different. Like Science, they're very brief. They might have 4 figures, sometimes 3 figures, tons of supplemental material, of course, but the main figures are very limited. It's a very brief paper. But now you look at Cell, and it's probably 3, 4 times longer. You have like 6, 7 figures, maybe 8 figures, like very long, meaty paper, okay, with a lot of experimental data. Now imagine you have like really stellar work you want to publish in the best possible journal. So you write it up and you submit it to Cell. And they review it, they reject it, and then you have to submit it elsewhere, and then you go to Science. Now think, how much time is it going to take you to write a Cell paper to a Science format? Like you're going to have to exclude some figures, you're going to have to shorten the text probably by a factor of 2 or 3. So it's going to take you forever. And then let's say you submit second time, then you submit a third time to another journal that accepts long papers, right? So like what you're going to do, take the first version, write, take the second version, write it. So because of that, what I'll try to do is when I select several journals where I want to submit the paper initially, I try, and that's really important, I try to select journals that are going to have a relatively similar format. So that when I submit to the first one, it doesn't work out. Before I submit to the second one, I just have to change the formatting, maybe a little bit, how I label the figures, but I don't have to rewrite the entire text. I don't have to write the entire discussion. I don't have to basically take half of my figures and put them as, into the supplemental figures and change everything. So that's why I'm saying this is a very important point that I want to put emphasis on. Select several journals and try to make sure that the papers in those journals, the requirements in terms of the length, format, and everything are going to be relatively similar. They're not going to be the same, but relatively similar. And that's going to spare you a lot of future work as you're basically resubmitting and trying to get a foot into the door. So then another thing what you got to do is you got to decide on the article type. Again, most journals have different article types, which can be full length, it can be a research brief. Again, if it's a review, it's typically, again, labeled a bit separately. But oftentimes they might have 2 or 3 different article types or versions, which again differ in terms of the length, how many figures they allow, how many citations they allow. So it's something you want to look into as well before you start writing the paper. So you write it, again, based on the appropriate format for that particular article type. Because again, one thing you don't want to do, you don't want to write an article where you're going to be like 30% over the permitted number of words or signs that you're allowed to use. And then after you've written and dedicated all the time, now you have to sit down and spend another week to shorten it. Okay. So this list was kindly shared with me by Natalia, and basically that shows different journals where people in the radiation oncology community frequently publish. Radiology is one of them with like stellar impact factor, obviously the Journal of Nuclear Medicine Radiation Therapy, again, very high impact factor. And again, it varies, right? So it goes from, again, maybe close to 30 to potentially some that have an impact factor of like 1.1, 1.2. Then obviously, you want to publish as high as possible, but then again, you want to try to select, like, for example, journals that have a relatively, well, they don't have to have a similar impact factor, but I would say select a range within what you think is reasonable. Like, for example, between 8 and 4 or something, and then submit there. So now we're going to talk about the article, the manuscript, or the paper itself. So what are the different parts of the paper? And again, that can vary somewhat based on where you're submitting, based on the journal requirements, but oftentimes they have essentially the structure, the skeleton is quite similar. So the first part is the abstract. And I have to say abstract is by far the most important part of the paper. Abstract is, as I'm sure you know, based on your own experience, when you open a new work, like a new paper that you want to read, you start with the abstract, and you really want the abstract to provide you with the information, with the brief information that tells you what the paper is about. It should tell you obviously why they asked the question, and so basically, like what should your abstract communicate to the audience? It should communicate really what you're looking for, what you're looking at, what you've been studying. A very brief summary of what has been shown before, basically what's known, and then the question, based on what's been known before, why are you asking the question that you're asking? And then basically you present your data. So you say, okay, we did this, this, and this. This is what we found. And then basically a brief discussion and explanation why that is important. And obviously, the abstract is important for the reader, but also the abstract is extremely important for the editor, who is going to be the first person to look at your paper and decide if the paper is even going to be reviewed or basically be sent out for review. Same thing is also true for the reviewer. When I'm asked to review an article, I read through the abstract, and ideally, and probably after having read the abstract, I'm going to get a very strong initial impression of whether I'm actually thinking the paper is appropriate for the journal or not. Now, of course, my opinion can change. Sometimes the abstract is very exciting. Then I start looking at the data quality might be not that good, and they might not really show what they say they show. And, there could be some other issues or vice versa, where I think, well, the abstract isn't too strong, but then actually the paper is really good. But oftentimes, especially if right away you get a better impression based on the abstract, be it because it's not written in an exciting way, or maybe it's not very clearly written, that's already going to be a big downside, because your paper might not even get to where it is going to be reviewed, because the editor might reject it right away. So abstract, again, short part of the paper, but extremely, extremely important. And so typically I would write the abstract first. Once I have the data together, you will constantly go back to the abstract as your paper is acquiring a shape and a form, and then rewrite the abstract and refine the abstract. So abstract is by far, in my opinion, by far the most important part of the paper, especially when it comes to writing and the quality. So after the abstract, normally the paper starts with an introduction. And oftentimes people, authors, reviewers, don't pay much attention to the introduction and think, well, it's there because it has to be there, but it's not that important. I disagree. I will say, and I'm going to outline where I think introduction is very important. Typically, if I read a paper just because I want to learn something new, right, I'm rarely read the introduction. So in that sense, introduction perhaps does not really matter. Because typically I'm familiar with the field, right? And I probably will know or should know some of the background. And what I'm really interested in is the data. So I might just start looking at the figures and the tables and get the data, that they have acquired. Now, when introduction really becomes important, if you are somewhat new to the field, or maybe new to that particular niche of the field, and you really have to educate yourself on it. And then of course, you can do a broad literature research and spend days or weeks on educating yourself, but you will probably not have the time. And in that case, a good introduction is going to be very, very helpful. And that is true for a reader, for the final audience, but it is also very important and also true for a reviewer, because as a reviewer, you really are expected to have a very good baseline knowledge of the field. And again, you might have a baseline knowledge, but you might not be very familiar with like some of the details that really precede that particular manuscript, right? And that particular finding. And your manuscript, like the introduction of your manuscript, should inform the reviewer about those details. And so obviously when you're reviewing the paper, you have to read the introduction, make sure that it's appropriate. But in fact, then the introduction really might matter a lot. That's why you should pay attention to it. Then comes typically materials and methods. Again, where the materials and methods are positioned within the paper doesn't really matter. So materials and methods, again, another tricky part. Oftentimes, people like to start with materials and methods just because it's relatively easy. You already have the protocols, and I think that's a good idea. Once you've completed materials and methods, at least you have a part of your paper already written up. That's good. What I will say is be detailed, be thorough. Don't really write everything that you've done in materials and methods. One thing that is not really a great way, to do it is to basically cite your prior works or somebody else's prior works where a particular protocol or method is outlined. You really should, it's fine to cite it when you got it from somewhere else or adopted it, or if you've used it before, that's also a great way to highlight your repeated usage of that particular methodology. However, you really shouldn't have to open another paper, another manuscript to understand the methodology, okay? It should be written there, and I think that that's really important. Then the results section. And actually, I think I actually have them a little bit in more detail. I probably should have advanced my slides. But anyway, so before we go to results, we're going to do question number one, or a question. I guess I invented a new word. But anyway, so question in the audience. So Natalia asked me to put a few questions and just kind of sprinkle them in between different slides. So I'll read the question, and then you guys please go ahead and answer. So what is a part of a manuscript? Abstract, discussion, methods, references, and then answer A is A, answer B is A, B, and C, and answer C is all of the above, and D is none of the above. Okay. So
Michael, we'll wait until approximately 80% will answer. So that's how we take attendance
okay.
by them answering the poll. So let's wait a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So there were some questions in the chat. I'm not sure if you know this, but the question from Olena: study effects of radiation by photons, electrons, and properties of sensor molecules, dyes, and biomolecules in the presence of nanoparticles, silver and gold, with biometric systems such as hydrogels. Which international journal would you recommend for publishing these results?
Okay. Let me see. Can I?
It's in the chat, the last question.
Yeah. Okay. Can I add the poll? Are we good? Or
No, I will end it. Don't
okay,
worry.
good.
Yeah.
I think I just can minimize it. Let me see. There you go, chat. All right. Yeah, thanks for the comments.
Any suggestions? Maybe Journal of Radiation Research?
Yeah, I mean,
Maybe
radiation,
medical physics, Journal of Radiation Research.
yeah, radiation research like the RRS journal could be appropriate.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to say based on the title. I don't want to like say this is where you should go. I would say pretty good to review at least the abstract, and then give you an idea. But yeah, if you like, feel free to email me. I assume Natalia is going to share my email.
Yeah, sounds good.
And see if I can.
Perfect. So most answered the poll, actually 100% answered. So majority said option 3, all of the above.
I agree with that.
Excellent. Stop share.
Perfect.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. So, okay, we talked about the abstract, we talked about the intro, okay, talked about materials and methods, and oh yeah, another important part. So the reason again why you have to be thorough, and especially I will say when it comes to clinical research, be it again prospective when you publish trial results or retrospective when you retrospective clinical research, which I assume most of you guys are going to be doing. Here, the reviewers really looked at your methodology and techniques that you used. Again, most of the time is going to be like how you did the statistical analysis, because that's going to be in part reviewed in the figure legends, right? Like which test you used, which p-value again you calculated, kind of how you define the p-value. But in the methodology, they're going to really look very thoroughly about which tests you use, like whether you applied the right statistical tests. So that's really important to outline what you did there. And then also make sure, again, related to that, the statistics are well explained. All right, so in results, again, results are going to be structured based on the paragraphs, right? You're going to have typically multiple paragraphs. You're going to have a title for each paragraph. I like to use as a title for each paragraph basically the most important finding, like let's say, like in a sentence, like for example, inserting a spacer hydrogel improves rectal toxicity or something like that, right? If that was like part of the paper specifically. Typically, I start every paragraph with a question or hypothesis, why we looked at it. Okay, so you explain why you formed this hypothesis. That should be just a sentence, then the hypothesis again, and then you outline what you did to answer that particular question. Then you basically present your data. you do not want to discuss the data, okay? But one thing that I learned is really good and also helpful for the reader, for the reviewer, is at the very end of each paragraph to summarize the data and also suggest what the data might indicate, meaning interpret the data. I wouldn't discuss them at this point, right? Discussing means, okay, so this is what the data show, this is what we think it means, and then based on prior studies, this is how it fits in. You don't want to go there, right? The latter part is part of the discussion, but I think it's always a good way to not just like, say there was a difference between the two cohorts and the p-value that was statistically significant, and that's it. And then you go to the next paragraph. I would summarize the findings of that particular paragraph and say what that suggests or indicates. Okay. And so that summary, in my opinion, is quite helpful. But just again, don't go into the discussion, leave the discussion for the discussion section. And so now again, speaking of the discussion, so we are now going towards the latter part of our paper, which is the discussion. And so basically the purpose of the discussion is to put the results in a broader context. Again, you're going to have different sections. Typically, what you normally start with is, again, summarizing very quickly, like one finding, and then you start discussing it. The discussion, honestly, can be anything. One is typically what future questions your work is raising, right? Like always, you answer one question scientifically, you basically asking 5 more. One important thing is also to not just cherry pick prior publications and then just say, okay, so what we found really fits neatly into this model, supported by this, this, and this finding. You also want to outline some publications that are being contradicted by your findings or that might contradict your findings, and then discuss why that might be the case. One very important reason to do that is that if the reviewer is really familiar with the field and they're going to know some of the works that might in fact contradict their findings, which is fine if that's the case, right? I mean, science is not about 100% consensus on everything. That's how sometimes we change our opinions. But if they know it and you don't discuss it, then they're going to take it as a negative point, because one of the critique almost automatically is going to be, okay, so some of the works contradict your findings. How can you connect that, right? How do you explain it? And so the best way, especially if there's really a very strong contradiction, like you show the complete opposite of somebody else, it's to really point it out and then explain why you think those two works, your work and somebody else's work, shows contradicting results, rather than just trying to kind of sweep it in the rug and hope that people are not going to pick it up, okay? Because your data contradicts previous data doesn't mean that your data are wrong or theirs are wrong, but you have to figure, at least, come up with ideas why that could be the case. Otherwise, your paper might be rejected just due to that. So it's best to really point it out, boldly say, here, that's what our work is contradicting, and then explain why you think that's the case. All right. So now, writing the manuscript. So when it comes to writing, again, we talked about what you do before you write it. Again, try to find a journal so you have an idea of the shape, the form, and the requirements for your manuscript. You should try to set a rough timeline, okay, for writing your manuscript to avoid procrastination. It's very easy to write, again, materials, methods, maybe abstract. Now you think, okay, now I have moved, pretty far, and now I'm going to take two months of a break and work on something else and then get back to the manuscript. I would try to, once you start, try to finish it. What I like to do is, again, before I write everything, even the abstract, I put the data and the figures together. So figures, tables, both the ones that are main figures as well as the supplemental figures, all data together. And on the one hand, that's already tells you about what your final shape is going to look like, but perhaps more importantly, once you start putting everything together, it might also tell you what gaps you actually still have in your work and what additional data you might need. And it's much easier to see right away once you really put all your figures, all your data together that you already have, rather than trying to kind of think in your brain and in your fantasy, like, okay, what do I have so far? What else do I need, right? Just put it together, have a PowerPoint presentation, whatever you use to work with figures, and then see what else you might need. And then again, you're going to need to strike a balance between having a complete manuscript versus delaying it forever until you have the best written manuscript at all times, especially given the fact that, there's absolutely no guarantee that the first journal you're going to be submitting it to will accept it. And so there's a very good chance that you're going to have to rewrite it anyway. It doesn't mean that it should be bad manuscript. It should be a great, well-written, really nice manuscript. But again, don't obsess over perfection in case, you have a tendency to do that. Now, again, this is, more of a loose suggestion. Actually, would start, you can start with the methods. I think that's not a bad thing to do. Probably right away or at the beginning, I would also do the abstract. I wouldn't wait for the abstract towards the end. I like to have a particular skeleton. But then within the main body of the paper, I like to do the methods, materials, and methods, then write the introduction, then the results, then the discussion. So the one thing that I've seen people do is sometimes they leave introduction for the end. I don't think that's a great thing. Also in terms of citations, because most of the citations that you're going to have are already going to be in the introduction. And then you can basically reuse them in your results and discussion. So I think, going this way makes a lot of sense, which is basically chronological order. I also strongly suggest that once you have a manuscript written, ask colleagues, multiple colleagues, to read it before submitting, and then incorporate their feedback. And again, luckily, we have our international outreach committee in Astro, so ask Astro colleagues, use them as resource. Myself, obviously, Natalia, and others. I'm sure everybody will be happy to help. One important thing is don't send it to people. I've done it before, so I'm guilty as, potentially many others, but don't send it to people and say, well, I'll try to submit in like 3 days. Can you read it? People are not going to have time for that. So really make sure you're going to leave them some time, at least a couple of weeks to be able to find time to read it and provide feedback. They might do it within a day, but you can imagine the feedback is going to be very limited and they're not going to pay much attention to your paper. But again, giving it to somebody else, that is true for manuscripts, that is especially true for grant applications, to get somebody else's opinion is important. And then you don't have to incorporate all of the feedback, but definitely take it all seriously and see what you can incorporate to make your paper better. Another thing, I don't think that that's really important to include, but then I've seen just very recently some of my colleagues that we published together just adding citations manually, like using Word, which is crazy. So absolutely use EndNote or maybe some other citation software that exists. I always use EndNote, so I'm not familiar with any other ones, but I'm sure the other ones. Use that software for your citations. Like, you gotta do yourself a huge disfavor if you place it like cite using just, copying stuff on PubMed and then inserting at the end and then see like where the citation is. It's extremely bothersome, takes a lot of time, and then you're just going to mix things up. So don't do it. Please use EndNote. I thought people switched to it like decades ago, but again, recently I just saw somebody doing it manually. All right. So now we're getting to the submission process. And Natalia, we have an hour and a half, correct? Till 9:30 Kiev time?
Yeah,
correct? Good.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So now the submission process. So now that's where the fun really begins, right? So now where you start getting into, okay, is it going to get accepted or not, right? So this is where the thrilling part begins. So I strongly suggest starting the online submission before you're actually ready to submit the manuscript. Meaning, what you do is you select a journal that is going to be your first target. You go there, create an account, and then you go to the submission portal and you start the submission. And there you're going to see all they need for the submission. First of all, obviously the format is going to be outlined, so you should know it before you submit as you're writing the manuscript, obviously, as I mentioned now 10 times probably. But sometimes then they see, okay, they also need a small paragraph of significance. They need the keywords, which might not really be listed, where they outline all the requirements, like, for example, the number of words in the abstract or in the main text body and so on. And so as you go through into the portal, again, they all look very different depending on the journal. You actually might start seeing what else they need for you to submit, okay? And that's why I'm saying create that account ahead of time so that you see all of that and you can then prepare everything, and not like you start submitting And then during the process, you're like, oh, actually, there's something else they need. So I have to sit down and spend another like 3 days on writing that particular part. Okay. Again, this is not a deal breaker, of course, but it's nice to know upfront what they need. And the only way to really know it is like once you're logged in and you have an account and you are in that particular portal. And then again, you can save everything, right? So then you don't have to do it from scratch. Um, Another important part is all journals require, and I mean, that's really intuitive, is that all authors on the paper know that they are actually authors on the paper. And believe me or not, that happens quite a lot when papers are being submitted with like 20 or 30 authors on them, and not everybody knows that they are actually authors. And the journals require you, especially if you're the corresponding author who is submitting the paper, to really let everybody know and make sure that they agree to be author on the paper. It happened to me actually when I was a postdoc. I was working with another guy who was a staff scientist in a different lab. And then I helped him with it was the second paper we worked on together. I kind of helped him with this. I didn't do that much. And then all of a sudden I get an email from Cancer Research saying that a manuscript was submitted with me being on it. I didn't even know a clue. I knew he was working on it. I didn't know he had already written it up and submitted it, right? So he didn't tell me. It was, quite a surprise because obviously you want to make sure that by the time the paper is submitted, everybody has looked at it, read it, and they really know what their name is on. And also the same is true for you. If you're a co-author and somebody wants to publish a paper, you should really know what's in that paper, right? Because it's your name, it's your reputation. Sometimes you might not want to be on it, right? That's why it's important to, again, make sure that everybody agrees.
Michael, do you mind commenting on authorship, first author, last author, and ethical consideration about this?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great point. I'm glad you brought it up. So, and that's really interesting. So, me coming, or being kind of with one foot in the clinical realm and another one in the basic science realm, I have to say that this actually is being handled somewhat differently, right? So, in basic research, translational research, lab research, kind of in general, typically, the person who does the work, which can be graduate student, postdoc, fellow, whatever, is the first author. And then the faculty member who is supervising everything, provides funding, who is leading the project, the principal investigator, is the last author and the corresponding author. Now, when it comes to clinical research, especially when it comes to clinical trials, that is actually rather reversed. And so oftentimes, and especially really true for like big clinical trials, thinking RTOG trials, the person who is the leader, the principal investigator, would be the first author, also the corresponding author on that particular paper. Now, again, we're talking about like really big, papers that might go to JCO, Lancet Oncology, kind of, and JM and so on. When it comes to retrospective clinical research, which is going to be probably 99.9% of all the clinical papers that we end up publishing, because as you can imagine, it goes so much into a clinical trial, and not all of us are ever going to run an actual phase 3 clinical trial in their lives. Maybe we will, but maybe not. But I think, probably all of us are going to do some retrospective clinical research at some point. Typically with those papers, again, based on my experience and what I've done as a PI, the person who does the work, so to say, meaning like really curates the data, does the statistical analysis, writes the manuscript and so on, which oftentimes is going to be a resident, a fellow, maybe even a medical student who is interested, or somebody else who's involved in research, is going to be the first author. But then again, the first author is the one who really does the job, the most work. And then the PI, which is going to be me, or you guys, who's a faculty member, is a radiation oncologist, is typically going to be the senior author, who is then also the corresponding author, okay? But I would say probably that kind of reversed thing is true for like large clinical trials, which I have seen. Like for example, the RTOG 0617, like the famous trial of dose escalation for non-small cell lung cancer that Dr. Bradley has run and published. He's the corresponding author, he's the PI, but he's the first author rather than the last. Okay. And then, of course, in terms of, there's always a question, well, should you include somebody or not? I mean, my opinion is if somebody has contributed to the manuscript, include them as co-author. I tend to be rather liberal than exclusive, but again, that's my approach. So again, so you make sure that all authors are aware. You should collect the conflict of interest statement. So make sure that there is, again, no conflict of interest. Typically, journals ask for it. So sometimes people take time to respond. So I would say maybe a month before you start submitting, let them know that they're going to be an author on the paper, and make sure that they are okay with that as you're sending them the manuscript to review, and then they also don't have a conflict of interest. Then once you've uploaded everything, right? So when you submit, again, they ask you to submit the figures, the manuscript, the text, abstract, and so on, the references. And it can be that they ask you to submit everything separately, and then basically the portal generates a PDF of everything. Sometimes they ask you to just make a PDF of everything and then upload that one. I actually prefer this because then I really am in control of making the PDF, and then I have everything in the way I want it. But regardless, so once it's uploaded, before you hit submit, then you will have an option to review what's been uploaded and basically the file that their website has generated. It's going to be a PDF. Download it and meticulously go over it. Okay, that's a very critical moment. It's the last time that you can proofread what you have uploaded. Sometimes you might have made a mistake and you chose the wrong file, right? And it's not the really recent, up-to-date file. And so then you want to do it again. But that's a critical process, so definitely take time to review everything before you hit submit. And then typically submission is free. I haven't seen anybody charging money for it. Now again, maybe that's changing. Like same way the airlines didn't used to charge you for bags. Now they do. I think some now even charging for carry-ons. So I'll be surprised if some journals say, okay, now pay me $100 to just submit. But so far I think I've never encountered that. All right, so now we're going to go to question number 2. So let's open the portal. So who is the person of contact at the editorial office for you as an author? So reviewer 1, 2, or 3, assigned editor or editor-in-chief.
Okay, so I'm ending the poll, sharing results.
So everybody said D, and that's exactly correct. Yeah, hold on. Still seeing the slides, or I think I screwed up something. Let's stop sharing some of them. Do you still see my slides, Natalia, or not?
Yeah, we
Oh,
see your
okay, good.
slides. Yeah, it's all good.
I must change. Okay, there we go. I just changed something on my screen. Anyway, so let's move on. Actually, I'm going to have question number 3 right after it. So who makes the decision regarding the manuscript? Reviewers, assigned editor, editor-in-chief, or the owner of the publishing company?
What's the maximum number of reviewers have you had in your papers?
I think 3. I don't think I have
The
a
maximum.
3. Sometimes if they can't find, let's say, one of them at the
Yeah,
time of
the
the submission,
client.
somebody else might come into place. I'm going to tell a story about it. Hopefully we have time.
Okay, sounds good. So I'm ending the poll, sharing results. So majority said
Okay.
C, editor-in-chief.
Okay, majority said C. So, okay, that's interesting because the opinion split here. So typically the person who is going to make the decision about your manuscript is going to be the assigned editor, most of the time. So reviewers, they make a suggestion, typically as a reviewer, and again, many of you might have been asked to serve as a reviewer. Again, depending on the journal, they typically ask you, what do you recommend? Do you recommend rejecting the paper, minor revision, major revision, or accept? Okay, but that's a recommendation. And then that goes to the editor, which is the assigned editor. And that editor, again, based on those recommendations, has to make a decision. So typically, it's the assigned editor. Now, in some rare cases, when, for example, I mean, the editor can always talk to editor-in-chief if he or she has any questions or is not sure, right? In that case, editor-in-chief can give some feedback, but in the end, it's still the assigned editor that will have to make the ultimate decision. I can imagine there have been cases in the past, perhaps in some really top-level journals, where maybe a paper has been rejected and the authors didn't agree with that, and maybe they even contacted editor-in-chief. In theory, editor-in-chief can overrule the decision by the editor, I would think, probably also depending on the policies of the journal, but it's also very rare that it's going to be escalated for the editor-in-chief to have to make such decision. It happened to me one time when I actually served as an invited editor, and it was a special issue in Cancers where basically we had to solicit papers, and then we actually found one, which was in physics. Nice paper, but it was in the journal Cancers, which is more focused on biology. And so, as editor, again, they submitted it, and but I think, yeah, because it was from the same institution as ours, I was not supposed to serve as an editor and make the decision, which makes sense, right? Um, but then they actually rejected. The editor was assigned and said, like, that doesn't fit into the journal. And then we argued with them that it does fit into our special issue. And then the person went to editor-in-chief and they still kind of rejected it. So that's really the only case where it happened to me that I had to kind of sort of deal with editor-in-chief, like in an indirect manner. But typically, it's the assigned editor that's going to be a person of contact and who makes the decision. All right.
Michael, do you sometimes
Huh?
reach out to maybe the editor-in-chief and ask if this is maybe topic of interest for you? Is this paper something that would be considered potentially or no?
I
Like in
wouldn't
a
necessarily,
high-ranking
yeah, I
journals
wouldn't
like
necessarily
Lancet.
reach out to editor-in-chief. I think, I mean, you might do that, but typically many journals have a way to do a pre-submission where you
Okay.
send the cover letter and perhaps the abstract, and then they can take a look and say, well, does it fit or not?
Yeah.
I don't think it's necessarily have to be an editor-in-chief who will make that decision. And I would
Okay.
presume if like all emails will be directed to editor-in-chief, that person is probably going to be happy about it. So that person will probably say, please use our pre-submission algorithm. Or if they don't have it, then they might just tell you like write it up and submit it. Uh, but I wouldn't necessarily reach out to editor-in-chief directly.
Okay.
All right, so now dealing with reviews. And so persistence is key in this case. Okay. Patience and persistence. So the first hurdle as you submit a paper to the journal, I'm actually dealing with it right now. I have a case report where we also did some additional genetic sequencing, and so we're trying to publish it, ideally as high as possible, but we already have like a few rejections from the editor directly where they didn't even send it out. But basically, the first screening process, well, actually, the very first one is the quality and control. So let's assume everything passes, then it goes to an editor gets assigned. And then the editor reads your abstract. Again, here the abstract is going to be very important. The editor might, well, very unlikely will go through all the figures and all the data. For him or her, it's most important to check if the quality is really good. What's the impact of your work on the scientific community that the journal is covering? Okay, or the specific journal is designed for. And then the editor can decide, okay, this paper is interesting enough to be reviewed, and then send it out for review. Or the editor might reject it right away and say, well, that's not interesting, or it doesn't fit. Maybe it's a great paper, but it just doesn't fit into the scope of our journal. Okay, so typically they look at the impact and the scope. And then in the end, once you get the review, so let's say, if it gets sent back to you, if it gets rejected, typically at this point, it's hard to really argue. You might, if you really want to, you can argue with the editor, mostly about the scope, sometimes about the impact as well, to still have it reviewed. But oftentimes I will say at this point, it might be even easier to just go to a different journal. Okay. So now, then the editor, let's say, decides, okay, impact is good, is high enough, scope is fitting, so he or she sends it out to the reviewers. The reviewers review the paper, return the reviews to the editor with their recommendation, and then the editor has to make a decision, okay, what to do with the manuscript. And these are the four typical outcomes. They can vary somewhat from journal to journal, but typically these are the outcomes. So the first one is the paper is accepted. That pretty much never happens, certainly not after the first review. I mean, at some point, if it gets accepted, right, it gets accepted, but oftentimes after every submission. But like to begin with, the paper is going to be accepted right away, I've never heard about it. This is very unlikely. And as a matter of fact, it is not, if that ever happened to you, I can tell you this is not good. Okay, we can talk about it in a minute why this is, my opinion, not really good, but this is not what you would typically expect. Then you can get a minor revision. This is also something that almost never happens. Minor revision is typically when the manuscript is pretty much accepted, but they might just ask to do a bit of, changes to a figure or change the labeling of this and this, right? Typically very, very minor things. Then the next one is major revision, which is typically what I would call the base case scenario, because again, your paper is certainly not accepted at this time point, but you're already one step much, much closer to it hopefully being accepted. And that's typically the most common outcomes of a paper review. And then the obviously last one is rejection, and then you have to think what you're going to do next, and this is what we're really also going to focus on. But anyway, so now, how do you deal with each of those decisions? So if you get, I mean, if it's accepted, it's accepted, right? You don't have to do anything. Well, you have to pay money. So that's the other, that's the other downside. But again, I promised you to say why I think that immediate acceptance is not a good thing. If it ever happens, that means that you sold your paper under price. Okay, that means that again, let's say you have a really nice manuscript and you submitted it to a cheap journal, and they look at it and they're like, "Oh, that's a great paper. Like we never get anything like this. We'll accept it right away." So that, in my opinion, means that you didn't do a great job and not a good diligence in selecting a good journal and selling your paper at the level where it should be sold. Okay, that's why I would say initial acceptance is never happens, and if it does happen, then you must have done something wrong in terms of your journal selection. So anyway, now you get minor revision. Let's say it even happens right away. Again, that's good, but very unlikely. So with minor revision, if you're at the stage of minor revision, then acceptance, I will say, is almost guaranteed. So it's up to you not to mess it up. You might do something weird and just argue with the editor about some minor things. Still, the editor gets angry and just says, I reject it, or I can't publish it in this way. You say, well, I'm not going to change it, and then you reject it. So don't do that, right? You're smart enough not to. Typically, in my opinion, minor revision means almost guaranteed acceptance, but you got to do what you got to do. Again, initially, it's very rare that you can get a minor revision, especially if you submit to good journals. It is more often what might happen is that initially you submit, you get a major revision, you address the comments, resubmit, and then the reviewers look at your resubmission and they say, okay, you've done a great job, but there are still a few minor things that we still want you to change. Okay. Sometimes it's because you haven't addressed everything. Sometimes it could be out of stubbornness by the reviewers. That's fine. But they might kind of recommend minor revision, and might say, okay, I change it from major revision to minor revision, just fix those little things, and then it will get accepted, right? So this is where I would say minor revision is more likely. Initially, it can also happen, which I mean is good, but more likely, I would say, after a major revision. Now, again, the emphasis I'm trying to make, and I've said it now multiple times, looking at the slide, stay diligent. Don't mess up by neglecting any comments or concerns. Don't, start, jumping around, being happy it's almost accepted and just do nothing. Really make sure that you don't upset reviewers or the editor. Do what they ask you to do, and then your paper will get accepted. Now, the most common scenario, major revision. Well, not the most common, because rejection is the most common, but major revision is the most common on your way to actually getting it published. So if your reviews come back or the decision come back says major revision, do not sometimes major revision can look very scary. They might ask you to do things that you think you're unable to do. They might and that can be just in terms of the methodology, because you're just unable to do it. It could be because you don't have the time, because it might take sometimes in basic research they ask you to do mouse experiments, and I think it might take 3 years to do, right? I might not be able to do it. I don't have the funds. But in general, I will say almost always, if you get major revision, try to, again, follow the comments, try to address them. And we're going to talk about how to do it in a minute, but follow through. I would not submit it to any other journal because there's a great likelihood that the other journal might reject it, right? And then you actually have taken one step back rather than making one step forward. So if you get major revision, deal with that and try to publish it there. It's not a guarantee, but it's already a big step towards getting it accepted. So once you get the comments, okay, read through the comments and decide what you want to address experimentally and what you want to address just by discussing, okay? You have to address every single comment and every single concern that the reviewers raise, okay? Don't leave anything out, not a little thing, okay? Address absolutely everything. You do not have to address everything experimentally, okay? And again, experimentally, I'm kind of, again, deviating a bit more towards lab research. So there it's really experimentally where we have to go back to the bench and do tissue culture work, maybe mouse experiments, maybe something else, okay? Maybe reevaluate the data that we already have just using a different technique. When it comes to clinical research and with respect to clinical research, typically when we talk about experimentally, it could be possibly add more data, like find more samples, again, if this is possible. Run a different analysis, run a different test. So, I mean, again, this is experimenting, but it's more, again, stuff that can be done at the computer rather than having go to the lab. But nevertheless, when I'm talking, say, experimentally, it means something that generates new data or additional data. Now, again, you don't have to address everything experimentally. I don't think I have addressed 100% of the comments by adding more data. You can do that, or you can discuss the comments, okay? I would say overall, so you have to address every single comment and concern, absolutely. But I would say ideally, you will address 50 to 70, closer to 70% of the comments experimentally by adding more data, because that's the most comprehensive way to actually do it. But you don't have to address everything 100%. But you have to address 100% of the comments, and if you don't add more data, then you have to discuss either in the results or discussion or possibly in your rebuttal letter, right? So typically what happens is you change your manuscript based on the comments, but then also you write a rebuttal letter where you exactly outline, you basically take all the comments one by one, and then you say, okay, thank you for this comment. This is a great comment. It helped to make the manuscript better. We addressed it this in this way. If it's experimentally, this is the data we got. We put it into this figure. You might even paste the copy of that new figure or like the changed figure. And if you don't add any more data, then you have to very thoroughly discuss and explain this particular comment and explain why your paper is still fine. Okay. Okay, end of discussion section should be limitation. Yeah, that's correct. So the discussion should be the very last part. And then basically, you write your rebuttal letter, you go comment by comment. Normally I have like, let's say reviewer one, and then I copy and paste what the reviewer, like each comment that the reviewer said. And sometimes one comment can have multiple comments, and then I would actually break them apart and address each part separately and say, okay, we did this, we did this. You want to be very, very polite, like almost to an extreme with each reviewer, okay? No matter how angry you are, sometimes the comments are dumb. Sometimes they haven't understood or haven't even read, and actually something they're asking is already in there. So don't tell them like, if you ask the question, please go and look at the figure 3, right? It's right there. So be very nice, very polite, because it's really about, getting the reviewers on your side rather than making them upset. So I always start like, thank you so much for wonderful comments. We addressed them. They were very thoughtful. That made it the manuscript better. And so we address them in these ways. And then finally is, again, as I said, your goal is to get the reviewers on your side, not explain to them why they are wrong, right? Sometimes they are plain wrong, and that's fine, but you don't want to tell them that. You want to be very diplomatic in that particular respect, okay? And one interesting thing is if you get the experience of actually reviewing a manuscript yourself, so what happens is, right, it's all human psychology. So first you get the manuscript, you read through it, and most of the time your job as a reviewer is to find flaws, right? It's not to say why it's amazing, it's to say why it's not amazing or why it's maybe amazing, but this is what's wrong with that, that's what needs to be fixed, okay? And so you're trying to be as critical as possible. Now you write up your comments, send it to the editor sends it to the author. And then maybe several months or maybe half a year or maybe a year later, okay, after you've completely forgotten what this whole manuscript was about, you get another email from the editor asking to look at the revision. And then you look at the revision, right? You have to remember again, typically, what this whole paper is about. The reviewer is not going to remember what it was about, right? You don't remember your own comments, so you have to look them up. And then you see how the author answered those. At this point, typically your mentality actually switches a bit, so you're not as critical anymore, especially like if you ask for a major revision rather than rejecting the manuscript. So at this point, you're really trying to see, okay, did they sufficiently address things to where you can accept it? And so you're going to be much more prone to actually look at the paper in a benign way than you were initially. That's why, again, you don't have to address all 100% of the comments experimentally by providing more data, but at least I would say 50 to 70% you should do, and that should hopefully flip every reviewer to accept your paper, right? So what you're really doing is you're trying to convince the reviewers to change the psychology from, again, saying there are still flaws to where it's good enough to be accepted. All right. Now, what if your manuscript is rejected? Okay. The question is here, does no mean no, or does no mean maybe? Okay. And the thing is, one thing you have to realize is that the threshold between major revision and rejection is pretty slim. It can very well be that, for example, two reviewers say major revision, one says rejection, the editor might still reject it, okay? But you again, you don't know what happened. Or might still ask for a major revision. So I will say if it gets sent out for review and it gets rejected, right? So you get the decision is rejection. One thing you want to do is obviously you take the reviews, you want to read through them very thoroughly. The worst thing you can do is just like, oh, okay, well, it got rejected. I don't care. I'll just send it to a new journal. No, you want to look at the comments because some of the comments can be very good. And you might get the same comments in the next journal. Probably not. You're going to get something different, most likely. But still, if there's really major flaws, then they might pick that up as well. But you definitely want to go through all the comments. You want to see, even if you don't submit to the same journal again, you want to see if you can use those comments to make your manuscript better, especially if it's really just more about unclarities or things like that. But in the end, you have to decide, do you want to go to a new journal? Or sometimes, and I'm going to tell you about a case from my own experience, sometimes you still might do the revision and you might submit it back to the same journal, back to the same editor, with the hope that the editor might again send it out to the reviewers and ask them to look at it again, basically look at the revised version. And as a matter of fact, rejection in that case does not mean no, it means maybe, okay? Because oftentimes, and I had that experience, they might say, no, I rejected it, so that's it, and then there's nothing you can do. But I will tell you, in many cases, even if it's initially rejected, and you have made a really good revision, you've changed a lot on that paper, they will probably still be prone to actually, I mean, they will look through it, right? But then they'll still might very well send it out to reviewers. And I can tell you that this scenario is probably better for you and will more likely result in your paper being published rather than going to a completely new journal, especially if they're at the same level in terms of impact factor and prominence, and you try all over again. And it can very well happen that you submit to one journal, it gets reviewed but rejected, and then you go to a journal that might even have a low impact factor, and they don't even send it out for review. It happened to me. Like we added one paper that I ended publishing in PNAS. It was my main postdoc paper. We had it reviewed and rejected molecular cell. We resubmitted it actually, and it almost got accepted. And we had to be perhaps a bit more persistent. They needed more experiments. But then we decided, okay, we'll just go somewhere else. And then we submitted it to G&D and I think PLOS Biology and another journal. And they all didn't even look at it. They didn't even send it out for review. It was like super frustrating. And I thought, we made a mistake. We should have tried to stick with molecular cell and ideally try to get it published there. So in the end, once you kind of feel like you're able to slip your foot into the door, I would say, keep your foot there, right? Even if it hurts, maybe at that point of time, the door's kind of getting slammed against your foot, but try to move through that little gap. It might in the end be your best bet. in terms of getting it finally published with less time effort than if you go to a different journal. Again, it's always depends on the individual situation and what you think about it, right? It's your decision. But I will say rejection does not always mean that the paper isn't going to be published there. So I will say resilience, persistence, and patience. I wrote patience, but I meant patience are really key to success here, rather than just going and then you get rejected, you bounce back, go somewhere else. Okay. And then so question number 4. What is the least likely outcome of a review process? Rejection, acceptance, major or minor revision? What happens least frequently?
We have around 48% answering, amending the poll, sharing results. So most people said acceptance.
Yeah, I agree with that. Again, I also don't know the statistics, but I'm sure if you looked up an AI, it's probably going to be the most common one. Yeah, typically it's very unlikely that's probably I should have clarified the question. I meant like on the first, like the first time you
First time, yeah.
Obviously, eventually you get accepted, right? So
hopefully, yeah.
Yeah, it's not like acceptance never happens. It does, right? Otherwise, we would never publish. But the question is really like when you submit it the first time. Anyway, all right. So let's move ahead. We're getting to the end of the talk. But yeah, I'm gonna tell you about how to deal with rejection, and then also tell you a sort of fun story from my own experience. So, dealing with rejection. Again, it's frustrating. It's normal, but again, research is mostly about frustration. Okay, especially lab research. Now, if you have submitted your paper multiple times and it just keeps getting rejected, even let's say at the first level, like when the editor looks at it and says, no, it's not good enough for a journal, some things you should take into consideration. First of all is, again, journal level, right? Maybe most likely you're probably submitting it somewhere where your paper just doesn't belong, right? That makes no sense to write up and submit every paper to Nature and see if it's going to stick. Most likely it won't, unless it's a stellar paper. Even then it, probably won't. But if it's, great, but not stellar paper, don't waste your time, okay? Journal focus, right? It's the first one is the impact, the second one is the scope. So maybe you're submitting it not to the correct journals. Oftentimes, if that's the reason for the rejection or for the editor not sending out for reviews, the editor is going to tell you. So you're going to know. They're not going to tell you like, oh, your paper is not important enough or good enough for our journal. It's kind of self-explanatory. But when it comes to the scope, they will actually be pretty precise, accurate about explaining you that. So you can use that as additional feedback. Also remember, and I mentioned it before, you're going to love your work more than anyone else, right? Your project, your work, your manuscript is your baby, right? You conceptualize the work, you've done the work, or work with somebody else who did the work, like you wrote the manuscript. So you will likely think of it better than other people, right? So don't obsess on publishing it in the best journal. If you have issues, get feedback from other people. They can help you gauge which journal level might be more appropriate. Maybe maybe you're aiming too high. Again, balance the journal level with the current need to publish. Sometimes you might need a publication. It's not very common, but again, I'm speaking more about the scenario in the United States, where, for example, you might be submitting a grant and that particular agency is going to expect you to have published something in that particular area to even consider your grant application. Or sometimes you might submit a big NIH grant and it comes back and they say, okay, grant is great, but one of the issues is like you haven't really published anything in this area. We would like you to see something published there. And you have the publication, more or less ready. Maybe you would delay it by a year and then improve it and publish in a better journal. But in this case, you might have to strategically submit it now, publish it in a journal that might be not as stellar, just to get your grant so you can continue doing your research. And so this is a strategic consideration that you sometimes have to take. I hate this kind of considerations, but unfortunately you have to do them sometimes. So again, you have to think strategically. Sometimes you need a publication for a promotion and things like that. Yeah, we actually discussed this. So this is the immediate acceptance of a paper after initial submission, good or bad. Then we can do a quick.
So while they are answering, maybe you can talk about like when is it appropriate to really argue with the reviewers?
Yeah.
And have you done this?
Yes. So perfect question, and I'll use the last 5 minutes to talk about it. So, well, first of all, you never argue with the reviewers, right? Because first of all, you don't know who the reviewers are, and you don't argue with them. You are as nice and polite and grateful to the reviewers as you can be in your communication. Now, obviously, you're communicating with the editor, right? And that's the person who you, in the end, can and, if necessary, should argue with. And you can do it, and you should do it. So I'm going to tell you a case. Again, this is about lab-based research. And it wasn't my, not primary my paper. It was a collaborator that we had at Duke. And so there was a guy, he worked in a lab of actually a pretty prominent PI. And he put the paper together. It was in DNA damage responses. And interestingly, the PI completely switched the fields. He went to study RNA, like non-coding RNAs, tumor microenvironment. Actually, was successful in that as well. But he didn't seem to care as much about the DNA damage anymore. So that guy, he came to our lab. He asked for some reagents, which we shared. Of course, they were already published. He included the data. He then asked us to and then he started submitting the manuscript. And he sent it to Nature and Cell and Science, and it all got rejected. And again, like based on what I said, he spent like months rewriting the paper. He then came back to me, was extremely frustrated, and I wasn't even an author on this paper yet. And we talked about it. I suggested a few additional experiments. I ended up also doing, a little bit of work for it. So then I ended up as a, I think, second author on the paper.
Co-author.
As co-author, correct. But the fun thing was because, again, the reason why I'm mentioning it, his PI just didn't care anymore. At this point, he just gave him his login to journal, to the portals, and said, just, deal with that yourself. And the guy, so he was from China. He was a great researcher, but his English, especially in writing, wasn't that great. So I helped him with that as well, in addition to just structure the manuscript and everything. And then in the end, I just kind of ended up doing the work of the PI, like writing the cover letter and also arguing with the editor. And so that's why I'm saying this, because I was really like at the forefront of doing it. So what happened? We wrote the paper, got it into a nice, to where I think I might actually. Yeah. So we got it to where we submitted probably for the fifth or sixth time, and then went to EMBO Journal. And that was the first time where it actually was reviewed. So the editor sent it out for reviews. 3 reviewers looked at it. And the paper was rejected. And, Xinhong was super frustrated. It was, like, as I said, 5th or 6th submission. So I looked at it and I said, look, the review is actually not as bad. Like most of them make sense, right? And we can address them. So he spent another 4 or 5 months in the lab doing the experiments. Like we rewrote the paper and submitted the revised manuscript. Now, one thing actually I was going to mention, but I forgot, but so I'll say it now. Before you do it, maybe right away, before you go this path, or if you're considering this path, you can always write to the editor and you can ask the editor, like, I think I can address the critique. Would you be willing, if I do so and strongly revise the manuscript, would you be willing to send it out to the reviewers? It's good to do it right away, because then, most of the time the editor will say probably not yes or no, but will say, well, I'll consider it, right? If the editor says, I will definitely not consider it, I don't care, then, well, you probably can't do much. But most of the time they will say they will consider it. That way you already kind of got your foot again back sort of a little bit into the door to where now you have sort of the promise, at least for them to consider it, to send it out again. So anyway, we wrote the paper and then, address all the comments and send it to the reviewers. And 2 reviewers looked at it and accepted it, okay? Especially one was like extremely critical to begin with. And the 3rd reviewer could not be found. Forever for the editor to look for that reviewer. He couldn't find the reviewer. And so what the editor did, the editor sent it to a 4th reviewer. So I'm kind of going back to your question, like, have I ever had more than 3 people review a paper? And the 4th reviewer's task was to look at the 3rd reviewer's comments and say if he addressed them sufficiently. But what the 4th reviewer did, the 4th reviewer took our manuscript and said, that's like the worst work ever, ripped it apart, said like, this is what I would want you to do, and you didn't do it, so there's no way I can accept it. and the editor rejected the manuscript, right? So he had like two acceptance, one the fourth reviewer
Okay.
rejecting it, and the editor rejected it. So the Shinhong, like the buddy of mine, he was like so frustrated, like he was about to cry, like literally. So I look at it and I say, listen, this is not fair. Like this is not a situation we should accept. Now we could have gone somewhere else and then submitted it and deal with another revision and everything. So I said, okay, let's give it a shot. So we wrote a rebuttal letter to the editor now and said, listen,
Mm-hmm.
this is not fair. What the fourth reviewer did is not what his or her task was really to do, right? The person brought new things that we cannot address, right? Because this is the first time we hear about it. And the editor thought about it, and I said, well, can you send it to a fifth reviewer maybe, okay, with the same purpose? And so what the editor actually did, he sent it to, I think, first or second reviewer who already accepted it and said, well,
Oh, I
the
see.
comments of
Unfavorable.
I couldn't find the person, like, do you
Got
accept?
it.
The guys already accepted the manuscript, so they said yes.
Right.
We actually, and I was kind of proud of it that we were able, and I think, the truth was really on our side, but we were able to overturn the rejection twice, really,
Mm-hmm.
right? The first time, the initial one, after we resubmitted a revised version, and the second time when it was rejected, as in my opinion, it was really not in a fair manner, but the editor, again, changed, his or her opinion, and in the end, we went from being rejected twice to the manuscript being accepted without any further experimental work. Okay.
Excellent.
So I would say,
That's a good
definitely
story.
try to argue. Like you don't lose out anything, right? It's just an email.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's a good story. So I'm sharing the result. Actually, majority said good. It's good.
Okay. Well, I would actually say, and I mentioned it before. Now, I wouldn't say it's good. And the reason is it's the only time when the paper is going to be accepted right away is if you send it to a journal that's like way below where you could have published it. And they look at it and they say, okay, because you can always find something negative about a paper. But if the level of the journal is so low, they might say, well, it's fine. I mean, the paper is good enough. It's probably the best paper we will ever publish in this journal. That's actually going to boost the reputation of the journal. So that's why I will say, if you select a journal wisely, most likely you're going to end up with a major revision. Okay, and then you'll be able to publish them. All right. So, but I think we're pretty much in the end of
At
the
the
talk.
end. Mhm.
Yeah, I think we're pretty much in the end. So, yeah, I would like to take a few minutes to answer any questions that might come up.
Thank you so much, Michael. Excellent talk. And thank you for sharing your experience. It's very valuable for
Absolutely.
Ukrainians. Many of them have not published their own papers yet. So that's very, very valuable. Does anyone have any questions to Michael? Well, people are maybe gathering their thoughts. Any suggestions for these people who have never published in the journals to how to get started?
Well, I mean, start by putting manuscript together. I will say, once you have data, then you can publish.
And I know that now maybe on many people's minds and with editors and writers as well is AI, right? AI is changing the landscape of writing. What's acceptable, what's not acceptable, what's ethical, what's not ethical in terms of use of AI when writing manuscripts?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, personally, I haven't used AI for anything yet, that I'm sure is going to change. I will say probably the first thing I would do is, again, once you've thought of a journal and you want to submit it, change their policies. They might have a certain policy on AI. Uh,
Right.
Again, I said I was submitting something like literally in the last couple of days, and I think they just asked me if I used AI. I haven't, so I clicked on that, and there were no further questions. But I don't know, like, if they would want any more additional information on AI. My concern, maybe I'm just old school or paranoid, and especially when it comes to lab research. My concern is if I use AI for writing the paper, I have to basically put out all my data on their server, right? And so I have no idea what they're going to do with the data. How can I make sure that nobody's going to steal it and then they're going to sell it to somebody? I can very well imagine that this is a possibility, and so because of that, I just felt not really confident enough to use AI for writing. I think when it comes to clinical research, it's somewhat different because it's really you own the data, like nobody else can really generate. Like in the lab, it could be a very complicated technique, but let's say I've shown something, if somebody else can do the same technique, they can and should be able to reproduce it. If they can reproduce it, then there's the doubt about what we have shown. But if they can reproduce it and it's reproducible, then they could relatively easily show the same results and then publish a paper before you, right? At least in theory. I would say with clinical research, it's probably less prone because again, it's your data from your institution
Right.
or multiple institutions you've gathered. So they, if they just steal it and blatantly kind of submit, it's probably going to be obvious, right? But that was like one of my concerns using AI is just like somebody might steal my data, especially like if it's going to take me another year or 2 years to get it published. I would say, in terms of ethical, I mean, I have no issues. I don't think there's any ethical concerns in terms of like using help to write a manuscript because again, you're not like falsifying anything, right? It's just to potentially get a better language. Um, I
So
hope,
use it more like a grammatical tool, right? Maybe improve the
yeah.
language on sentence level, not on paragraph level, and maybe not generating context because the AI can create a lot of imaginary things, right? That don't
Correct.
really
Yeah.
exist.
I mean, one thing I wouldn't necessarily do is also just take, let's say, figures and like few, kind of explanations of the results, and then just ask AI to write the entire paper. I mean, once you have it, I guess you can probably write, run it through AI or some spelling grammar check to make sure that it's written well and then reads well. Probably, grammar and then style is what's probably style is what's going to be improved the most overall. And again, if you're close to, again, just going back to my initial concerns of somebody stealing the data, if you're close to submitting, then that probably is fine, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
gonna be able to scoop you within like several days if you just like do it right away. I assume at some point, probably even in near future, there's gonna be again, for pay AI websites where you can upload the data and hopefully again they treat it in a secure way that you don't have to be concerned about getting scooped, then hopefully it will become helpful and you can use it. I mean, in the end, really, the way AI works is you give it ideas, it gives you spits out something, then you use the text, and then you still have to go through it. You will likely alter it to your liking, right? Change citations, change this and that to where it looks good. So it's a help, but it's not really going to do the job for you.
Sounds good. That's a good answer. And maybe the last one I'll just ask. So you mentioned the length a little bit, how long it takes from, let's say, starting writing the paper all the way to it getting published. Like, what's your longest? What's your shortest? Just from your experience, so they get
Yeah.
the idea how long it takes.
I mean, again, for me, I mean, probably the longest would be lab research projects. And again, what takes time there is oftentimes when you work in the revision, you have to do experiments, and they might take really long time. Sometimes you might have to ask, or actually, oftentimes you have to ask for an extension, which works. But then,
Mm-hmm.
year and a half is no exception at all. For clinical research and retrospective clinical research is going to be much faster because typically you can address things just by doing additional analysis. Oftentimes you probably will be able to do it within weeks. So then the time frame becomes much shorter, I will say. I mean, I don't know, shortest published maybe within a few months, I would say.
Yeah, 3 months for me. I think 3 months. Frontiers in oncology, it's really efficient. The reviews are interactive. So once you submit the paper, the reviewer is already reviewing it, and you can respond to their comments. What just one reviewer responded, right? And you wait while you're waiting for reviewer 2 and 3. You interactively can respond, and that
Really? Interesting.
really shortens the time of
Oh.
the review, and it becomes very efficient. So I've had
What
good
what
experience.
journal what
It's
journal offered such an option?
frontiers
Oh, okay.
in oncology.
But
So
how's then the like if the editor doesn't get the decision of from all the reviewers at the same time, like how do they handle the decision in the end?
editor then looks at or each comment separately, and then makes a decision. So then you can upload your revised manuscript, but you can respond to comments as they go. So
Okay.
it makes it a little bit more efficient, I think.
Yeah. No, that's nice. So it seems like more of a dynamic kind of,
Review.
interactive way of reviewing. Yeah. Overall, I think
Mm-hmm.
it's good. Yeah. I haven't heard of such an option,
Yeah.
but hopefully it will become more common in future. I like that.
Yeah, it makes it very efficient, I think. Awesome. Thank you so much, Michael. That was a great session. And thank you, everyone, for attending. Thank you, Michael, for preparing the slides and sharing your experience. So I think we learned a lot. Some of our participants are writing papers on their projects, so they will use this lecture as a great tool to move forward. Thank you so much. Thank you,
Yeah, thank
everyone.
you,
We'll meet
everyone.
in 1 month.
Thanks,
Thank
Natasha.
you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.